America is rolling out the red carpet for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. On this special broadcast, we'll be looking at India, US, and the unspoken China factor, taking a close look at how to understand the relationship and the geopolitics of the time. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. The Prime Minister has touched down in New York. He hit the ground running with a slew of meetings with business leaders, among them Elon Musk, who, of course, went on record to say how much he was a fan of the Prime Minister. Diaspora diplomacy is something that has the Modi imprint. What will be its ripples back home? That's one question. The other question, of course, is the very interesting multilateralism of India. India, once known for its non-aligned principles, today is pushing for strategic autonomy and what the foreign minister, Mr. Shankar, has called reaping gains from as many relationships as possible. On this broadcast, with experts joining us from all over the world, we look at the central question. Beyond the rhetoric, the photo ops, how do we understand what's going on? Prime Minister Modi will be addressing for the second time the US Congress. He will also be a state guest at a special dinner at the White House, only the third such world leader to be hosted by the Biden administration. All of this happening at a time when domestic politics in the United States are also in churn. In fact, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, making headlines, some would say, for all the wrong reasons. Let's introduce our guests on the program today. Joining us is a strategic affairs analyst, Chirayu, who's with the National University of Singapore. Good to see you, Chirayu. Also joining us is veteran diplomat, former Indian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Meera Shankar. Welcome, ma'am, as always. Also joining us is Michael Kugelman, one of the best-known foreign policy analysts at the Wilson Center in the United States. And also joining us is Seema Sirohi, a veteran journalist based out of Washington, D.C., who's long had her eye on the US-India beat among multiple other beats. Welcome, everybody, to the program. As I said, the Prime Minister has met with the diaspora. He's met with business and thought leaders, and 22nd will be when his day is spent at the White House. Let's just step back, Ambassador Meera Shankar, and let me ask you, how much of this is about China? And I start with China for two reasons. Right before the Prime Minister touches down, you have US Secretary of State actually making a trip to Beijing, saying we do not support an independent Taiwan. And then right after those talks, Biden calls Xi Jinping a dictator and China hits back. I put this in context because a lot of people in the United States are making the argument that India and the United States are going to be defined almost entirely by one word, and it's China. How do you see it, ma'am? Meera Shankar.
I think the relationship is a broad-based relationship, which has economic elements, technological cooperation in the strategic sectors of defense, intelligence sharing, and also now in critical and emerging technologies, in education, science and health, in energy and the environment. So it's a pretty broad-based relationship. Of course, there is a cementing factor and a driving factor, and that is the shared concern that both countries have about an increasingly aggressive China in the Indo-Pacific, whose behavior has caused concern among its neighbors, both in the maritime domain as well as on land with countries like India. So there is this driving force bringing the two countries together. But I would say that the relationship is a much broader relationship where there are both shared values as well as shared interests.
Well, we had the spokesperson in Washington, D.C. making, ma'am, the sort of argument you're making. This trip is about India and US. It's not about Russia and China. This is John Kirby. Listen in.
We're looking forward to where this is going. It's not about, the question about whether this was about China. This state visit is also not about Russia. And what we're trying to do with our bilateral relationship with India is improve the bilateral relationship on its own, for its own sake, and on its own foundation, because it's that important to us. It's not about forcing or coercing or trying to convince Prime Minister Modi or the Indian government to do something different. It's about focusing on where we are in this relationship and making it more important, more robust, more cooperative.
Michael, let me take this to you. It's not about Russia or China. Is anyone going to believe that? Michael?
Well, I certainly think that the China factor has sharpened the strategic dimensions of the relationship over the last 2 years. And I think that that really has been a big explanation for the rapid growth in security relations over the last few years. But I think it does go beyond that. And in that sense, I agree with Ambassador Shankar. If you go back to the early 90s, when India began to open up to the world with a number of economic liberalization reforms, that generated opportunities for more trade with the United States. And I would argue that the economic dimensions of the relationship, the trade partnership between the U.S. and India, even though there's some tensions in there, that's proceeded separate from the China track, quite frankly. And we've seen pretty significant levels of robust bilateral trade over the years. But yeah, I do think that at this moment in time, given just how strong the U.S.-China competition is, given how intense it is, it's only natural that the U.S. is going to look at its relationships with so many of its key partners and allies through that lens. And even if you go back historically, looking at the arc of history of U.S.-India relations, China has had a major impact on the relationship's trajectory. If you go back to the late 50s, the early 60s, when the U.S. was concerned about the growing power of communist China, it looked to India for a brief period of time as that country that it could work with to strengthen partnership to counter China. Obviously, things would change after that, especially when the U.S. moved closer to Pakistan. But yeah, it's a combination of the China factor and the Russia factor plays a role as well. But this is a relationship that's multifaceted and functions on track separate from the China issue.
Right. I think that's an important point, Seema, that there are parallel tracks and there are many tracks, right? There's the China track, there's what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, on which India has a very, very different position from what the United States might seek. There's the economy. There's the fact that India is a huge market, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. There's the big Boeing purchase. There's, a purchase of armed drones that is possibly on the agenda. And there's the Quad. But on the other side, there's India also hosting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and India is able to go from a meeting of the foreign ministers of the SCO in India to hugging Joe Biden in Japan on the sidelines of the Quad. How do we understand and explain what Shankar calls multilateralism?
Well, the world is in a flux, that we know. And there are multiple engagements among multiple sets of countries, and everyone's sort of trying to manage this very complex situation that faces us today. So at this moment, India finds itself kind of hemmed in by China. We have a hot border situation with them. And China's attempt to dominate Asia and then the world, perhaps, brings US and India closer. The US doesn't want to lose its primacy in the Pacific. So there are all these things happening at the same time. For India, Russia remains an important partner because nearly 60 to 70% of our defense needs are met by Russia, but India is also diversifying at the same time. So if the General Electric deal comes through, where an American company will co-produce the jet engines in India, that's a huge leap forward in terms of diversification. Then the fact that India is also trying to be self-sufficient. All of these factors are playing together on the world stage at the same time. And it takes a very deft government, a very nimble foreign minister to manage that. And so far, I think India has done a good job of managing it. Nobody is, except for China, nobody's really upset with India in the sense that, we're not being shunned by anybody. In fact, if anything, India is being courted.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And a lot of the old sort of statements about democracy and rights seem to have been at least sort of dialed down in public. And we'll get to that in a moment. Chirayu, I want to bring you in because you've done some very interesting research looking at how India actually votes at the United Nations, and you've actually made this point that India and the United States, this is your paper for Stimson Center, are friends elsewhere but foes at the UN. And we broke this down into easy to access sort of numbers for our audience. And if we can please bring this up now, Chirayu, you basically found that if compared to other members of the Quad, which is a loose security formation, four-member formation, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, then Japan and Australia have aligned 80% with the US at the UN, and in comparison, India has aligned only 20% of the times, which is a very, very interesting finding, right? So, Chirayu, I want you to tell us more about this. Chirayu.
Yeah. Barkha, thank you for having me. And while I was researching about India-US ties before joining the Stimson Center as a visiting fellow there, I was finding it a very interesting and a unique topic to work on India-US ties. And what I found was that despite the proximity since the early 2000s, the nuclear deal, etc., that we talk about, the patterns of their voting at the United Nations, they have more or less essentially remained the same since the time of Cold War. So that is one area where this warmth has not penetrated. And then I looked at why nobody's talking about it, what are the mechanisms, so on and so forth. And honestly, I mean, neither side is very much upset because both appreciate each other's position, that why India cannot vote in a certain way and why United States is voting in a certain way. So there is a mutual appreciation of each other's position. But what was underlying is that because they both are tolerant of each other's multilateral positions, the potential remained untapped. So they have not found essentially good mechanisms where they can exchange views, they can talk about. So we are hearing a lot about defending norms together, and there's this rules-based international orders, and you have to defend those rules, etc. But nobody's talking about setting the rules, because it is these institutions that set the rules, and that is one area where both countries are not working together. Now, some of these positions are historic; they cannot be changed. They are frozen, but the important bit here is there are also low-hanging fruit, and I'll just give you one example. NSA Dowal was there. We talked about ICET, etc. But until I wrote this paper, there wasn't any mechanism between India and the United States where they talk to each other bilaterally on how to harness and synergize at the ITU, which basically sets the norms for telecommunications around the world. So we are seeing China as an emerging threat to Huawei and other such similar things, but we are not seeing these two countries working together. So I think multilateralism was one area where I saw the optimal warmth not penetrating there, or results not coming to working together, and that's the gist of this paper.
Very interesting. I see Ambassador Manju Seth also join us. Welcome. Meera, Shankar, I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Shankar. When you look at Chirayu's numbers, India would look that to underline the argument about strategic autonomy. That look, we are a partner, we are in, we have strategic cooperation with the United States, but it doesn't actually dictate how we behave with the rest of the world. And I think Teresa Schaffer made this point that India and US have their biggest disagreements when it comes to multilateral issues and not bilateral issues, right? How do you see that? Is there a point at which what some might call India's tightrope, balancing, let's say, the SCO with the Quad, managing relationships with China on its own terms, buying oil from Russia, looking to Iran to bring it into the SCO? Is there a point where any of these issues, Ambassador Shankar, will become problems with the United States? Can we unmute, ma'am? Yeah, go ahead, ma'am. Yeah.
I hope we will be able to navigate these issues. And as far as the voting patterns in the UN are concerned, as Chirag said, some of this is historical. But I think we have to recognize, when you look at other members of the Quad, they are developed countries. All of them: Japan, Australia, the US, and B, they are alliance partners. Now, India is a developing country, and therefore our perspective on many of the issues which the UN takes up are bound to be different, because we seek to keep open the potential for India to develop its own capacities, even where it may not be in a position today. So, for instance, to take a look at the whole nuclear issue, when we decided not to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we were quite far from, actually being in a position to exercise a nuclear option. But the fact was that China had already tested, and therefore, in terms of the definition of the treaty, would be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. And therefore, India had this dilemma: how do we cope with a nuclear armed China in future? And so one of the issues was we stay out of the non-proliferation regime, so that even if we are not in a position to exercise the nuclear option today, we are not foreclosing the option in future when we have the technical capacity to do so. Now, this became, for instance, a major point of difference between the US and India. And therefore, all the resolutions on non-proliferation issues in the UN, our voting pattern would have been different. Similarly, if you look at, the whole question of trade, yes, India has opened up, but at the same time, it wants to keep the capacity to develop in certain sectors. For instance, let's say we still retain quite high tariffs for automobile imports. And actually, that is what has enabled foreign countries to invest in India, so that they could produce cheaper automobiles for the Indian market. Had we opened up across the board, I have absolutely no doubt that we would not have an auto industry in India today. So there is, a divergence which flows from our different levels of development. There is also a geostrategic convergence in the Indo-Pacific, but not necessarily in other parts of the world where there may be divergent perspectives, as on Ukraine. And therefore, I think this gets reflected in the voting patterns in the United States. After all countries have to grapple with the huge asymmetry of power that they have with the United States, which is the number one global power. And they seek to build coalitions or to, forge positions which will give them some negotiating space vis-a-vis the United
Right.
States.
Let me bring in Michael before I go to Ambassador Manju. Seth, I hope you can hear me, ma'am. Michael, one of the points I saw that you made on Twitter is that the Biden administration finds itself in a bind when it comes to what's being called the democracy debate, right? The fact is that a few murmurs from the Biden administration led to a sharp sort of pushback from the Indians. And whatever's going to be expressed about how the Americans see India's record on democratic institutions, I think will happen in private, if at all. I think it might happen. I think it'll happen in private. How do you see this sort of playing out domestically in the US context?
Yeah, well, certainly, the Biden administration, maybe for the first time since the Jimmy Carter administration, has elevated democracy promotion and values, so to speak, to a core priority for foreign policy. And that's why I think many are asking this question with Modi coming to Washington about how the U.S. administration will go about this issue. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's very clear that that even this administration has concluded that it's better not to make this a public matter. And I think it's concluded that it's best to certainly bring up the issues. And I'm quite confident that President Biden himself will bring up these issues to an extent in his private meeting with Modi. But it'll be done very carefully. It's not going to be pushed. This is a state visit, and of course, state visits are meant to be very prestigious, and they have to be perfect, and everything has to go off very well. So you don't want to have an awkward moment. You don't want to have a moment of
how much of an issue is this?
I mean, it is an issue for sure in a general sense, just because of, I would say, pretty significant concerns within the administration on interagency levels about the internal situation in India, and what many here describe as democratic backsliding, a phrase that I know many in India don't agree with. But I just think that for very obvious reasons, because interest will always trump values and moral considerations in international relations, even in the context of an administration that wants to emphasize values more broadly in foreign policy. And that suggests that there simply is a strong desire not to risk rocking the boat, so to speak, in New Delhi by bringing up the types of issues that this government in India clearly does not want anyone externally to bring up, even close partners and allies of the United States. And I think that for rights activists and others that are critics here in the United States of the Modi government, that's a tough pill to swallow. But I think that's basically what it comes down to. But again, this is an administration that for many years, I would argue, has been defined by values. Go back, I was reading the other day the joint statement that came out of the first state visit by an Indian leader here in 1963, about 60 years ago to this week, when President Radhakrishnan was here. If you look at the joint statement, there was language referring to the world's two largest democracies. President Kennedy, when in his public remarks welcoming the Indian president, he mentioned this notion of democracies working together. So that's been very consistent for many years. But at the end of the day, it's not the values bit, it's the interest bit that's going to drive the partnership and has driven the partnership.
I would agree with that, but let me bring in Ambassador Manju Seth. When it comes down to it, what do you think we should be looking for as the centerpiece of this visit?
As mentioned by the other panelists, it's a very important visit. And yes, certainly, I think there will not be a public focus on any of the sort of criticism part of the what is being criticized about India, about India's democracy. If you recall, recently there was also this statement by the spokesperson, NSA, the security spokesperson, saying that go to India for yourself and have a look. What is it? Is it how nice things are and how good things are overall. Of course, there are some. They did put a little caveat saying that there are some issues, but overall, it's a very vibrant, living democracy. So I think that'll be the focus. In private, they will bring up a few of these things, but overall, it is a very. It's going to be a kind of game changer. I feel this visit is going to be a game changer because it is. It's a state. It's going to change the way India and US have been looking at each other, and the way US has been looking at India. And of course, the driving force is absolutely interest. If there was no interest, and America's interest was not served, India's interest was not served, I don't think this visit would have taken place. And it is in India's interest to, at this point of time, go along, collaborate with the US, and including in the Indo-Pacific and what we see on our border, the LAC. With China, we are seeing that things are not the best.
Right.
And, so we have to absolutely have friends wherever we can. And right now, our interests are converging. The US's interest and India's interest is converging. And it's, I think, the right moment, in my view, that both the countries have come together and they both have understood this. And it is an opportunity for both to take it to the next step.
Let me just bring in Seema and Chirayu at this point. Seema, we have a very interesting comment from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who told the media in the US that there's no question of lecturing India on human rights, but when the United States sees challenges to press religious or other freedoms, we make our views known. Now, we have seen a certain degree of pretty sharp pushback from the Modi government when this has happened. Let's also remember the history here. The Prime Minister was once denied a visa under the George Bush administration. This is the same Prime Minister who is now addressing the US Congress for the second time. This is the same Prime Minister who's only the third world leader to be hosted as a state guest at the White House. Do you see this democracy question being a major talking point within the United States? I should also underline, because I'm not sure how many people of India follow this closely, that Biden himself is, entering an election year. His own son, Hunter Biden, has just negotiated a deal where he's, where there have been allegations of tax fraud, gun possession, as well as addiction. So I think a lot of Indians would turn around and say, is the US really in a position to lecture us whether they do or they don't?
Look, it's not a question of gotcha, like, your democracy is flawed, so is ours. That's not the issue here. US foreign policy, I would contend, has always been based on interests. It's self interest. They've been friends with some of the most awful regimes in Africa. Look at our neighborhood. There was a genocide going on when before Bangladesh was created. And what was US policy at that time? So democracy issues come up when there's not much else going on in the relationship. So yesterday, when these 70 odd senators and congressmen and women released this letter urging President Biden to raise the democracy issues with Modi, the letter had a long preamble about how important this partnership is, how India is crucial for technology, for all of the issues that this relationship is being based on, this visit is all about. It's about the future. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, defense cooperation, what have you. So the point I'm making is, I'm not 100% sure that Biden will even raise it in private. If he does, very likely it'll be framed very gently that, look, India's democratic model is a source of attraction for other countries. And the whole thing everyone's trying to do is to present an alternative model to China, right? So, in that kind of indirect way,
Yeah.
at the official level, I am surprised, having watched this relationship for 30 odd years, I am surprised how vigorously US spokespeople have defended India and the perceived backsliding on the democracy.
Of democracy. Let's just spend 2 minutes talking a little bit about talking about that, Chirayu. Let's bring you in. I mean, is this really an issue? The point is that, yes, I agree with Seema that it's not a gotcha moment. Indians can look to the US and talk about racism, abortion, what's happening with women's reproductive rights. We can look at it and say, listen, you guys did a poorer job of transitioning out of a defeated election than India has, where election results have always been accepted peaceably. But it's not a competition. The fact is that we do have these lawmakers who are putting pressure on Biden to say, raise this. Do you think this pressure counts for something that is deep, or do you think, as has been suggested, that this is a very marginal issue given everything else that's happening? Chirayu.
I think, Barkha, I would more or less agree with what Seema has said. Even if it is raised privately, it would be in a very gentle fashion. And I'll just take you back to a few years. Now we have, thanks WikiLeaks, a lot of detailed report of what used to happen in the past. So remember when Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, and there were attacks on churches in New Delhi. State officials, when they would come, the transcripts are now in public domain. They used to raise these issues with Manmohan Singh, but they would also raise these issues publicly. And it used to look like there is some sort of haranguing that is happening, and India is being like, there is a light knuckles on the rap, etc. But I think that perception is changing for 2 or 3 reasons. First is the set of major things that has already been spoken about. The China factor first. The second is the desire to work in other domains. Like China is a threat in the strategic domain, but in the economics domain, in the technology domain, in other areas, multilateralism that I spoke about, there's a desire to work together. So the White House, whoever is there, understands that you cannot, this is not another Manmohan Singh, or this is not another Indian leader who will take all this public criticism lying down. So it might disrupt the momentum that is in the ties right now. Second thing, as you said, that this is no more the era of the early 2000s or the late 90s when you didn't knew what was happening. Now something happens in the United States, you get the news here immediately in India. And I mean, the the set of things that you raised, the kind of agencies like Department of Homeland Security, the way it is going after Trump, and it is too light on the documents that found in the Biden place, and it is going all after going all after Trump. These things are seen in its own light in India, and people are pointing fingers and saying that, hey, what about your democracy? So I think here what is happening is the kind of orator that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is, and the kind of the well-oiled machinery it has, it can actually create an unfavorable public opinion here in itself. So I think there's a combination of factors, therefore, that the White House will take this very delicately. And if I can be, what we are seeing is a flurry of commentary that is coming out of United States that, oh, we don't have value alignments, therefore you should not be giving jet engines to India, or similar other things that are coming in the front pages of Foreign Affairs. But I mean, look at Kissinger. He went to China. What was value alignment there? So, as Seema said, interests are right now driving these things, and even if this is raised, it will be done marginally and very delicately.
All right. Before I go to the two diplomats, I want to bring in Michael on this. Michael, I think the consensus in this conversation seems to be, at this moment, the Biden administration needs India for multiple reasons, and therefore, this democracy issue is more a subject of the Western press's editorial writing and the Indian left's editorial writing than it is actually going to be an issue between the two countries. Do you agree?
Yes, I would agree. And also, I think it's important to note that much of the criticism in Washington about India's democracy and rights record, it comes from members of Congress, mainly progressive Democrats. And, as we all know, members of Congress do not make policy. They don't set policy. They pass laws and so on, but they don't make policy. So it's an important distinction to be made between the legislative branch of the government here and the executive branch. And yes, absolutely. I think that the stakes are very high, as seen from Washington, in that the relationship with India has to continue. It has to continue to deepen, with China being a key factor in that regard at this moment of time. I mean, India is seen, I think, as, from a U.S. government perspective, as Washington's best strategic bet in South Asia. To work with the U.S. to counter China for reasons that we all know. Its location, of course, its own deep rivalry with China, the size of its economy, and so many other things as well. And we haven't really gotten into this yet, but this trip and this state visit, it's not only about talking about defense cooperation to counter China, but the U.S. really looks at India as a country that can play this role of counter to China in non-security ways as well. I mean, the idea of making India a bigger part of a diversifying global supply chain, particularly for critical and emerging technologies such as semiconductors, to reduce the world's reliance on China for that. This is a big goal of the administration as well. So there's just a lot of stake. And so while the values issues are not irrelevant in the relationship, as seen from the administration, ultimately, yes, they will be subordinated to the broader goal of working with India on strategic levels.
Ambassador Meera, Shankar, one of the arguments that I made, and this is, something that's being talked about a lot by different foreign policy analysts, is whether India will ever be a US ally. Now, our foreign policy, our diplomats are hardwired into historic non-alignment to begin with, and now we're talking about multilateralism. So, this impression, maybe in sections of the Hill, that India could one day be, pivoting almost entirely to the United States of America. I don't think it will ever happen. I don't think our diplomacy is made that way. But I defer, of course, to your expertise and Ambassador Manju Seth's expertise. And my question to you is this: when you were serving as ambassador to the United States, what were some of the most prickly points that you found you had to keep countering and explaining to the Americans, and how much has changed since then?
Well, I think, to talk about the prickly points in the relationship at this time might not be the most appropriate thing. I think I would like to focus a little away from your question on what the major outcomes of this visit could be. And one, I would say there are two pillars really where you're seeing very substantive movement in a significant way that could be a game changer. And one is in the defense side, where we have been seeking defense technological cooperation with the US. Now, while the US was willing to sell us sell us weapons, and we bought $20 billion worth of weapons from the US, there was reluctance to actually manufacture in India or share technology. Now, what you've seen is that India, on its part, has greatly liberalized the framework for FDI in defense manufacturing in India. And at the same time, the US has worked to overcome the obstacles to actually concretizing a very major proposal. So the proposal to manufacture the GE 414 engine in India, along with HAL, with very substantial transfer of technology, I think will be, in a sense, an inflection point in the relationship. The second element I would focus on is what Michael mentioned, and that is that, the whole Washington consensus of leaving everything to the free market has been fraying for some time, and the heyday of globalization seems to be over, with the US adopting a more nuanced trade and industrial policy. Now, as it seeks to reorder the global economy and it is looking to build alternative supply chains to de-risk its overdependence on China. And that provides a window of opportunity for the two countries to work together and for some of those supply chains, some of those technologies to be produced in India. Till now, mostly it's been going to Vietnam. But in this visit, you may see some announcement of an investment possibly by Micron in the area of semiconductors. They're calling it packaging of semiconductors, which would be the final step of encasing it. But it would be, again, a significant shift. And if it's not a one-off, if the GE and the Micron deals are not one-off, but we are able to use this to create an ecosystem where the two countries learn to work together, and where, this friendshoring that the US Treasury Secretary spoke of encompasses India in a very major way, then you are going to see a very much more substantial relationship between the two countries. Now, to your question about, whether India could be an ally, we aren't an ally. We have not joined as an alliance partner, but we are a major strategic partner. And the strategic relationship has been growing in depth and substance. So we have signed all the foundational defense agreements for cooperation in logistics, communications compatibility and security, exchange of geospatial data, and now we are shifting on to manufacturing. So I think you are seeing, the building blocks of a far more substantive, more trusting strategic partnership between the two countries.
Yeah, let me ask you this, Ambassador Manju Seth. What for India will define a successful visit beyond the sort of feelers and the atmospherics and the dinner and the photo ops? What will India look to achieve? I think Ambassador Shankar has listed some of the specifics. What would you add to those?
I would further add that the fact that the ISET was signed, the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies, and which will also include artificial intelligence, plus the drone technology that is likely. I mean, at the moment they're going to give us drones, but I think even the drone technology that has been talk of sharing that with us, and our startups in both countries. I think that is the future. Startup ecosystem and co-location of these startups, and for them to work together to come up with innovations, and not just doing basic, collaboration, but coming up with new innovations which are of, not only for India and the US, which are important, but also for the world. Coming up with absolutely new, innovative solutions, I think, is the future. And that on that as well, already agreements are there, but I think this visit is going to push that that collaboration, that co-location between what is the future technologies that are coming and which are taking over the world, and how to regulate the use of AI, etc. We know ChatGPT, if it is allowed to go sort of unregulated, then I mean, we can be sure that the world is in trouble. So that needs to be regulated. And we really need to, I think that is also going to be another thing, that on new technologies, we will work together, we will have to create regulations. And of course, as Ambassador has mentioned, Ambassador Shankar, that, this visit is going to be about to some degree of transfer of technology and changing and bringing the supply chains, part of the supply chains into India, which is an important element of our whole initiative of Atmanirbharta and our aim or our ambition to be a certain emerging power.
Right. The Prime Minister is, as we speak, sort of arriving at the venue that you see on your screen. It is Yoga Day, and he is going to be leading that sort of what should I call it? Yoga conclave or collection of people doing yoga. So we're going to see that up on our screen. I guess in a few moments from now, I don't see the Prime Minister in those pictures, but I guess he's reached the venue, and we should be able to, those are live pictures from the United Nations headquarters. We should be expecting the Prime Minister to step on that stage, that venue very soon. Chirayu, soft power, yoga, the thought leaders that the Prime Minister met with, an interesting eclectic mix from the man who coined the phrase Black Swan to Elon Musk, right? How did you see that moment, especially given the very polarized debate around India in some of the sort of public intellectual circles in the United States of America?
Yes, Barkha, thanks for the last sentence, because before I exactly come to the question, I would like to congratulate for a nicely written column, and it was really an interesting read.
Thank you.
And I think, yeah, I think you raise a very important point, that India would never be an ally. And you ended there, and you ended on a very positive, informative note there, just to drive the point home. But there's a second part of the debate, as you said, in the American intellectual circles, that India would not be an ally like Japan or South Korea maybe, and that's the reason we should be cautious in our investment in India. And I think that is something hitting of a straw man as I see it, because I have not seen since the early 2000s any American grand strategic document, or for that matter, any president saying that my South Asian policy is a failure because I was not able to bring India closer as an ally. Without being an ally, the comfort that we are sharing right now, Ambassador recently mentioned of the 4 foundational agreements, the kind of tech transfer, the kind of body language, the kind of things that we work on, the breadth of the relationship. I mean, why do you always need a treaty alliance document? And if India is not willing to sign the document, or if India is a little bit uncomfortable with the word alliance, so what? You are still managing the work together. Of course, there is a room for disagreement, and compared to it, and you rightly pointed out my own research, so compared to Japan or South Korea, your room for disagreement be a little bigger. But so what? You're still, there is an unprecedented level of comfort. You are working together. You are taking the challenges head on. So that is, I think, this old early Cold War era mindset that only you are friends or only you can work with someone who has signed a formal treaty alliance is I think there is some change required in the Beltway discourse there. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect, you talk about the eclectic mix of people that Prime Minister met yesterday in New York. Now, look, what I see is that what Prime Minister has taken upon himself is a task that, apart from being the Prime Minister, he looks himself as the CEO or the brand ambassador of the India story. And therefore, he wants to sell the India story to a set of academics. He wants to sell it to the set of business people and say that, look, what I have made changes is in the regulatory framework in Gandhinagar, come open your campuses in India, or for that matter, come invest in India. I'm doing reforms, etc. So I think, and those developments also help him politically here at home. So I think it's a Janus-based strategy where you sell India's story abroad, reap the benefits at home, and I think if you ask me, from this perspective, he's doing a phenomenal job.
Yeah, and I think you make the important point that to not be an ally doesn't mean that it's not a relationship worth investing in, and that those old models of you are with us or you're against us, those Bushism, the era of the Bushism is over. I want to bring in Michael, and then I give the last word maybe to Seema. Michael, any red flags that you see in the relationship? Can we unmute Michael? Michael, you're muted at your end.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yes,
I
go ahead,
don't.
yeah.
At this point in time, I don't see any red flags. I mean, there's some trade tensions that got worse during the Trump administration, but clearly there's a desire on both sides to work through those. And there was a recent strategic trade dialogue that was established for that very purpose. The Russia factor is not as much of a tension point as it had been right after the invasion began. The administration, I think, certainly does not agree with India's decision not to take a strong stand against Russia, but it's accepted that, and it's playing a longer game with India and trying to make the argument that over the longer term, Russia will cease to be a helpful security partner to India, and the U.S. is trying to position itself as a country that, with its allies, can fill the gap and try to start supplying India with the types of material and supplies that it's received from Russia in the past. So I don't think that's a red flag anymore. We've already discussed that the values issue is not going to be a problem for the relationship. So I think that, quite frankly, at this point in time, the relationship is probably at its strongest point. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat things, but it's in a very good place. There's a fair amount of trust and goodwill. At this point in time, I don't envision any major red flags. Obviously, one never knows what could come up 5, 10, 20 years down the road. But at this point in time, things are in a very good place. I should also say that issues like Pakistan, which, for example,
I was just going to say that we've just done an hour of India-US without once mentioning the word Pakistan, and and that makes for an interesting change, because at least, Michael, before I give the last word to Seema or anyone else who wants to come in on this, there was a time when Indian prime ministers used to take India's anxiety about terrorism, for example, to the United States of America. The first time Barack Obama, in a joint statement, for example, I think it was Manmohan Singh, then spoke about the Lashkar-e-Taiba. That was, Pakistan was still part of the framework of the conversation. It doesn't happen now. There is no reference to Pakistan. We didn't make a reference in this whole conversation. That's a shift.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I fully agree with you. And I think that since U.S. forces left Afghanistan, the relationship with Pakistan here, it's still there. I mean, there's still formally an alliance with Pakistan, but there's not really much to that relationship. And quite frankly, it's not a major point of discussion in official circles in Washington either. And that could only benefit the U.S.-India relationship more broadly.
All right, Seema, last word to you. As the yoga sort of conclave starts, the real meat of this visit will, of course, be what happens at the White House meetings. What should we be looking out for?
So a couple of points I want to make. There's a new overall policy framework designed by the two national security advisors, from which a lot of initiatives are coming. So my only concern is about delivery, because especially in Washington, this visit has been sort of, for a lack of a better word, hyped so much that if it falls short on delivery, then it would be a matter of concern. So I would watch over the next 1 year in terms of this GE engine deal, how much gets done, how much training gets done, and things like that. But on the positive side, the sale of these armed drones, I think, is very significant. I know the officials have not framed it this way, but what it does is that it gives India an American platform that kind of brings India more into the structure of other US allies who are operating in this region, right? So interoperability becomes much better. We are not going to say that in public, of course, because we are always shy of admitting that we are leaning this way or that way. In terms of being an ally or non-ally, I think this is now a pointless debate, mainly in sort of think tank circles, because the American officialdom has absolutely accepted the fact that we're not going to sign a treaty and become like, Japan, Australia. They're not looking for it. We are not ready for it. They're not looking for it. So where's the problem is my question. So people keep talking about what will happen in a contingency. If there's a Taiwan contingency, I'm sure there has been discussion. It'll never be in public as to what India can offer. And when that situation develops, there'll be plenty of time to discuss it. And in all these military talks that we've been having, indirectly, those issues have been discussed. So I'd say it's a very significant visit. Watch out for the results. Watch out for the joint statement. It'll be hefty. And then follow what happens later.
All right. Thank you. We leave it there to Seema, to Ambassadors Meera, Shankar, and Manju, Seth, to Michael, to Chirayu. Thank you very much. The next 48 hours are going to be interesting. We'll be tracking it very closely here at the Mojo Story. We will say thank you to our guests, but our live coverage of the Prime Minister's visit to the United States of America, where he is, of course, a state guest, and he will be addressing the U.S. Congress, continues. You can catch the Yoga Day, where the Prime Minister is taking part on our platform, the Mojo Story. In the meantime, we're signing off for now. I am signing off for now, as are our guests. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.
We started Mojo right here in this basement. Just 4 people, 4. And now we're about to hit our first 1 million subscribers. So this is to say thank you to all of you for your support, for your respect, and for your encouragement. We've always gone to where the story is. During the pandemic, when television's big anchors were hunkered down in their studios or at their homes, we hit the road. We traveled from Delhi to Kerala, covering 30,000 kilometers in a small car, reporting from inside ICUs and inside slum tenements. Whether it's flash floods or war zones, we've always put our boots on the ground. In fact, we're just back from Punjab, tailing the Khalistani fugitive Amritpal Singh. And through all of this, we have always put you, the people, first. In an age of partisan polarized media where most journalists are either chamcha ya morcha, we believe the story is sacred and the truth of the story is what matters. And now as we get ready for the next step, we need your help. Become a Mojo member and get first access to all our big interviews. Get a chance to ask our newsmakers questions. Get a chance to write and report for us for both our website and our channels. And also, interact with me and my colleagues directly through AMA sessions. Literally, ask me anything. Click on the join now right next to the subscribe button, and yes, also subscribe if you haven't yet, and become a Mojo member for just 159 rupees a month. Hope to see lots of you in our community.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.